Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Ana Burkhardt Perez. I am the Neville Bryan Assistant Curator in Architecture and Design at the Art Institute of Chicago. I am delighted to welcome you to today's program, held in conjunction with the exhibition Bruce Goff, Material World, and one of its related installations, New Affiliates on Goff's Domestic Matter. To begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. Thank you very much. And support for today's program is provided by the R. Solomon Lectureship Fund, for which we are extremely grateful. Today's program features Bruce Goff, Material World's curators, Alison Fisher, Harold and Margot Schiff, Curator of Architecture and Design, and Craig Lee, Assistant Curator in Architecture and Design, in conversation with the principal founders of two leading architecture firms who continue to find inspiration in Bruce Goff's work, New Affiliates and Norman Kelley. Joining us from New Affiliates is Evie Diamantopoulou and Joffre Kolb. Their studio works across a range of scales and typologies, from ground-up buildings and interiors to residential, commercial, and cultural projects. Over the last decade, they have developed an expertise in large-scale exhibition and installation design through ongoing collaborations with leading art institutions, including the design of Bruce Goff Material Worlds. The installation New Affiliates on Goff's Domestic Matter, which is on view in our gallery 285, features their composite drawings, which explore the form of three Goff houses through the visual language of graphic novels and Bruce Goff's offbeat and unexpected materials. Joining us from Norman Kelley are Carrie Norman and Thomas Kelley. Founded in 2012, Norman Kelley works in residential architecture, commercial interiors, furniture design, exhibition design, and design criticism. Their process is sensitive to place and irreverent to tradition. They have contributed work to the Venice Architecture Biennial, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and the Lisbon Architecture Triennale. In addition, they are the recipients of the Architectural League of New York Young Architects Prize and a United States Artists Fellowship in Architecture. They are also close collaborators of the Art Institute of Chicago, having worked on the redesign of the permanent collection galleries of the Department of Architecture and Design. We are honored to be joined by these important figures in architecture and design, and we look forward to hearing about how Bruce Goff's groundbreaking work continues to inspire architects today. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Okay. Thank you, Ana, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. We're thrilled for the opportunity to be in discussion with our speakers, Evie and Joffre of New Affiliates, and Thomas and Carrie from Norman Kelley, two firms who have been engaging deeply with the work of Bruce Goff. I trust that many of you have seen the exhibition on Bruce Goff, and if not, please put it on your calendar, as you have just one more month before the exhibition closes on March 29th. This exhibition is the first retrospective of Goff's remarkable life and career in over 35 years, following the donation of his collection to the museum in 1990. Co-curator Craig Lee and I worked to bring forward many new stories about this maverick modern architect, ranging from his many collaborations with artists, his innovations from the player piano, and his deep engagement with changing ideas about the American West. You will hear more about exhibition's design from Joffre and Evie, but I'll point out two areas that bring new attention to lesser-known aspects of Goff's work. First is his deep engagement with everyday material culture via the large cache of his personal possessions held in the museum's Ryan and Burnham Art and Architecture archives. Encompassing everything from clothing to building materials and samples, everyday objects that Goff lived with throughout his life, this category, termed realia by archivists, show us a new way to understand the unconventional materiality of many of Goff's architectural projects, as well as physical evidence of his incredibly varied sources of inspiration. Second is Goff's remarkable painting practice, which spanned more than 6 decades and resulted in over 500 works. These ambitious abstract paintings include early transparent watercolors, as well as dynamic pieces from the 1960s that show a wide array of experimentation with new materials and methods of paint application, including day glow and fluorescent colors, stenciling, spray paint, and mixed media collage, including metallic stickers and faux fur. None of these paintings have been reproduced and very few exhibited before, making this selection of the exhibition and catalog undertaken by Craig Lee and conservator Kelley Keegan a real contribution to Goff scholarship. We're here today to talk about Goff's legacy and influence, largely within the context of the architectural profession. During his lifetime, Goff occupied an interesting role, neither truly an outsider nor truly an insider. It is true that he did very little self-promotion and was well aware of the sometimes polarizing nature of his practice, acknowledged in a rather iconic quotation, quote, "I've been controversial ever since I started. I can't help it. I'm neither ashamed or proud of it. It is just what happened." On the other hand, his work was widely published by the architectural press, beginning in the 1920s, with Richard Neutra, for example, who included Goff's striking Tulsa warehouse in his 1930 book documenting the rise of a new ultra-modern style of architecture in the United States. In the post-war period, Goff's domestic designs also captured a generation of Americans, with no fewer than 3 prominent designs featured as standalone articles in Life magazine, which during the 1950s had a readership of 5 million people per issue, so pretty remarkable. And here's showing you photographs from Life magazine of the Ruth and Sam Ford house, a watershed in Goff's practice. This single-family home had a distinctive pumpkin shape created by repurposed Quonset hut ribs painted a bright red orange, creating a dynamic open volume that accommodated Ruth's cantilevered studio, a sunken lounge, and a fireplace and kitchen below. Goff's work had a second resurgence of popular coverage in the swinging 1970s, with the splashy publication of Shannon Kahn, Joe Netsuko Price's spectacular home in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, in the pages of Vogue in 1972. Another venue for Goff's influence was his role as an educator and chair of the architecture school at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. There, Goff developed a curriculum that stressed creativity and independence, mentoring young architects and expanding the school's cultural footprint, organizing lectures by modern architects, such as German-born Eric Mendelsohn, and hosting listening sessions of modern classical music. Now known as the American School, in the 1940s and 50s, Goff program was one of just a small handful of architecture schools working to define the modern movement in the United States, alongside Ludwig Mies van der Rohe at IIT and Walter Gropius at Harvard. Goff students were ambitious, experimental, and more importantly, forged their own architectural trajectories and vocabularies, following Goff's often quoted tagline about the school, quote, "We preach no dogma." A number of graduates of the OU Architecture School found themselves in California, working closely with the landscape, natural materials, and the burgeoning environmental movement of the 1960s, a connection highlighted in a recent exhibition called Outre West, shown in Kansas City and San Francisco. However, the very lack of a dogmatic style at the school is one factor that has hampered a strong identification between Goff and the next generation. Yet his influence spread in other ways. In a 1988 foreword of the first monograph on Goff by Professor David DeLong, architect Frank Gehry described Goff as, quote, "a model iconoclast whose interest in exploring, quote, awkwardness, irresolution, and the unfinished mirrored the concerns driving his own groundbreaking practice." Goff's lifelong obsession with music, both as a consumer and producer of modern composition, has proven another avenue to his sustained relevance, as explored by contemporary artists, including Stephen Prina, an artist, musician, and composer whose multifaceted project, The Way He Always Wanted It, engages with diverse interpretation of Goff's player piano compositions and architecture and film and installation, a subject that he's covered for nearly 20 years. And for more on Prina's project, please join us for a screening of his film on Thursday, March 12th. Goff's values of individuality and freedom continue to find new audiences, and as we'll hear in a moment, serve as generative models for both art making and pedagogy in architecture today. I will now hand the floor over to Thomas. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us, Allison and Carrie.
Yes, thanks so much for conceiving of the exhibition and for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. Our talk is 14 Alterations, Tulsa. Back in 2020, just before the world shut down, Thomas and I, traveled to Tulsa with 14 Harvard GSD students to test an affirmative attitude toward the found. It was a studio, and asked how buildings mature from flawed origins and how alterations might arise from their construction, use, and cultural histories within a complicated past. As mentioned, our site was Tulsa, now and 100 years ago. Context mattered, not only our existing buildings and their architect, but the time and place in which these buildings emerged. During the early 20th century, Tulsa was known as the oil capital of the world. We explored this economic history and how its oil booms, specifically between 1920 and 29, bore a significant impact on building culture. The studio also ventured into Tulsa's more painful past. With the centennial anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, our context expanded to cover the impact civil disorder and racial violence had on the residents of Tulsa. Amid this boom, violence, and eventual decline, we focused on 4 largely overlooked Art Deco-ish buildings designed by then 23-year-old architect Bruce Goff, while working for the firm Rush, Endicott, and Rush. These 4 buildings, built between 1927 and 29, included a private club/office, a theater/house, a warehouse, and a factory.
I'm going to talk a bit about Building 1. The first of these is the Tulsa Club. Built in 1927, the Tulsa Club is an 88,000 square foot, 11-story building that housed a private social club for wealthy white men above offices for Tulsa's Chamber of Commerce. Its program combined repetitive office and hotel floors with distinct public gathering spaces, and the building is organized around a double-loaded corridor flanked by small offices or guest rooms on each level. This repetitive plan is punctuated by larger communal spaces like a grand lobby, a 400-person banquet hall, and a penthouse event space with access to a 3-sided roof terrace created by the setback 11th floor. And quick shout out to the Art Institute for sharing us these beautiful drawings. Here, a steel frame clad in Bedford limestone and articulated by vertical zigzag pylons and aligned steel casement windows extending the height of the building would eventually be partially obscured by a 2-story Blackstone renovation in the 1950s. Here, an interior view from 1929. After bankruptcy and decades of vacancy, however, the building reopened in 2014 as a boutique hotel, now connected to adjacent structures by Skybridge and garage.
And here, a building that is in the show upstairs, our second building, designed in 1928 to 1929 for a piano teacher, Patty Schreiner. The Riverside Studio is a 4,500 square foot hybrid of music studio and residence. Today, it operates solely as a small theater, but its original conception blurred domestic and performance space. Situated along the Arkansas River amid Gothic Revival mansions, You'll notice that smooth white stucco exterior stands apart from its context. Here, the plan prioritizes performance. Symmetrical sequence of foyer, recital hall, and stage organizes the building, while the attached house feels secondary and a bit spatially awkward, requiring passage across the stage to reach the kitchen. The domestic wing, as you can see, reads as a kind of an appendage to this primary musical axis. The exterior is restrained but idiosyncratic, marked by a double-height circular window at the entry and a curious composition of windows that relates to a notated musical meter you'll find on the floor plan that Goff drew. Inside, the spaces were lush and theatrical, gray-green Japanese wood paneling, aluminum-leafed ceilings, dark blue-stained maple floors, a fireplace of black glass and green marble, and murals by Olinka Hurdy. Converted in 1941 into a speech drama studio, the building remains a working theater today, continuously staging The Drunkard and the Olio every Saturday night, so long as a minimum of 5 tickets are sold.
We're halfway there. Building 3 is the Guarantee Laundry Building. Built in 1928, this building houses a 25,000 square foot triple height interior, originally intended for a commercial laundry business to provide support for Tulsa's growing hotel economy. Located along Route 66, the north facade addresses one of America's most iconic automobile corridors, and inside a vast open work floor dominates the plan, interrupted only by 21 steel columns, exposed metal trusses, a laundry chute, service elevator, and boiler room. This north facade was once dramatically staged. Above the modest entry door floated a 4-story neon sign flanked by 8 half-spherical light fixtures, an image Goff repeatedly privileged in photographs. The doorway itself is framed by spiderweb-like metal mullions, recalling contemporary American Art Deco. Surrounding this, intricate yellow brickwork introduces a different lineage of Dutch influence, recalling the expressive masonry of the Amsterdam School. Horizontal brick banding across the facade further suggests an affinity with Eric Mendelssohn's department stores. Original drawings indicate that Goff had originally envisioned the north facade to seamlessly curve at the corner of Route 66 and South Yorktown Avenue. Unfortunately, the corner was built at 90 degrees. Unlike the rest of the building, the south and west facades were treated with red brick, and after closing in 1966 and sitting vacant, the building was converted in 1979 into storage. And alterations from then have been minimal. The fourth building, completed in 1929 as the Tulsa branch of the Pittsburgh Equitable Meter Company, the 7,700 square foot factory supported Tulsa's oil boom. The company promoted itself as the most modern meter regulator and valve manufacturer in the world, and this building functioned as its westernmost outpost. The building fronts Charles Page Boulevard and backs directly onto railway tracks once tied to the Sand Springs Railway. Its siting is infrastructural rather than civic. The rear facade angles to meet the oblique rail line. The plan was straightforward: a front office, factory floor, and rear loading dock equipped with a gantry and operable garage, allowing goods to transfer directly onto rail cars. A partial concrete basement sits off-axis, you can see with the stair, while subtle shifts in floor elevation respond to the height of freight cars. From the street, the building may read as a horizontal brick monolith, a parapet of mirrored triangular forms framed by brick pilasters marks the entry. Beyond that, corbelled brickwork and tan soldier courses articulate the structural bays. While Goff's later career would make use of angled geometries as a means to convey formal variety, here the angled devices are restricted to a single facade element in keeping with zigzag modern ornamentation. Today, the building stands vacant. Some window bays have been retrofitted in red brick, as you can see, while others are infilled with yellowing ETFE panels. Working across these 4 early Goff buildings, Our students began not with design, but with looking. In part one, they produced unconventional as-built drawings intent on exposing the physical and cultural misalignments, uneven histories, and social contradictions embedded in each building. And in part two, these observations became strategies. Here you see some student work. Rather than restoring, preserving, or simply renovating, students proposed alterations that emerged directly from the building's flaws and context. There's a lot of mythology about Goff at this time. He's writing to Frank Lloyd Wright, getting information about not going to school, and looking at a lot of architecture that he couldn't visit. So a lot of it was largely derivative, but spoke to someone who was practicing, developing both as a professional, but also as a critic of his context. The aim for our students was not to overwrite this history, but to amplify it so that these buildings, also shaped by oil booms, social stratification, and obsolescence, might matter differently to a broader public. And I think what's kind of fascinating to be sitting here on this podium with our friends Evie and Jaffer is that the studio culminated in an essay which had the same title as the studio, Sick Building Syndrome. We published an essay on the work in Log 51, and the title of the studio was derived from an essay that Jaffer actually wrote about our practice back when we were only drawing, no buildings really to speak of. Our essay reconsiders Bruce Goff's early Tulsa buildings, works often dismissed as derivative, not as minor preludes to his later career, but as socially and materially entangled artifacts of a volatile oil boom city. It asks what a meaningful alteration might be, not preservation, not renovation, but a deliberate intervention within unstable historical conditions. Drawing on theories of alteration as exposure, the text frames SIC, S-I-C, as both index and method, a way to register error and transform it into architectural agency. In this sense, the student work extends Goff's project. Through close analog observation and speculative revision, perception shifts from private act to public consequence. The aim was not to canonize these buildings, but to look again, to treat Goff's early work not as prelude, but as unfinished matter still capable of producing architectural consequence. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for being here. Is my microphone working? Because some people are gesturing. Okay, great. Some people mean all of you. I'm Evie Diamantopoulos.
I'm Jaffer Kolb.
And together we're representing our team at New Affiliates.
So we are surrounded by Goff experts on this stage, including Carrie and Thomas. We are not Goff experts, but Goff means a lot to our practice, and getting to work on this project has been amazing. So we want to walk through that a little bit. So this is an oil drill, cellophane strips. There we go, marbles, which are actually here built between these kind of glowy pieces of glass cullet, and finally ashtrays. These are all objects that are embedded in Goff's buildings, sitting alongside more traditional building materials, bound together in surprising and kind of precarious arrangements. These and many others were drawn from a kind of recognizable cultural landscape. They're particularly American. The oil drill, a connection to extractive industrial capitalism. The cellophane strips, an ode to the post-war proliferation of plastics that became ubiquitous across American life. The marbles to childhood and play, and the ashtray to the home. Resituated, they produced buildings and environments that stood far outside the canon from which they were drawn. They were immersive. Styrofoam discs, for example, acting as ceiling panels, or the glass cullet that you saw earlier, kind of embedded into walls. These pieces function like a memorial, or maybe a kind of predictive archaeology, highlighting the byproducts of local consumerism, its excesses, its ruins, and its opportunities, all kind of folded into an architecture. Goff, as you can see, was no stranger to a dollar store, but his eye traveled beyond, to the Navy, where he served, to forestry, to landscape, to Asia. Embedding, produced as a kind of act, produced a compositional logic to much of his architecture, which, while formally coherent, contained a unique grammar of the found and the invented, all kind of mashed together into new arrangements. He was a voracious collector, but not just of inspiration, but in fact of actual materials that would come together that would form these complete buildings. The evidence were kind of artifacts that you could discover like Easter eggs if you were so willing. This produced complete worlds of kind of scattered pieces. And they weren't just decoration or ornament, but actually sometimes acted as structure itself. I'm going back to the Quonset frame that Allison showed earlier, that he used at the Ford House in an earlier iteration that we just saw, but also that he evolved by turning it on its side and producing a radial grid that made a donut. For us, Goff's architecture reveals something of time, the temporary nature of building from process to maintenance.
And in designing the Bruce Goff exhibition, we got to consider really how to assemble material of different kinds, media and chronology, into the space of the Art Institute. And we really began with this idea of a loose, relaxed, if you will, assembly. Starting from the very elements that make up the exhibition, walls and platforms, they don't all touch each other, also loosely are composed across the galleries. And they're meant to encourage different ways of viewing and experiencing the exhibition. We use those to layer material and to create links and associations across the content. And would like to think it approximates a little bit how we imagine Goff saw the world. On the one hand, with the clarity and vision regarding the contained project, and on the other, as a cross-sectional survey of stuff glued together, like rocks and cullets and marbles and cements. We read closely his rather open plans and free-form sections in his buildings and interpreted those as a spectrum of circulation from the steeped plinths and the pedestals to the walls and cracks highlighted in neon inspired by his non-linear approach. Goff's relationship to objects sets the tone of the exhibition and evolves as one moves through to reveal a sweeping interest in alternative cultures, ranging from reuse to appropriation to decoration. And as we track that aesthetic universe across media, to us, what was really so inspiring in getting to be part and a study of his legacy was to enliven the content. To see the world through his curious and opportunistic eyes, and to invite visitors to imagine what kinds of objects and paintings and dollar store finds and television shows drew his attention to those trinkets. And very fortunately, while working through the material and being fully immersed in Goff's and Allison's and Craig's worlds, we were invited to participate in the 2024 Beta Biennial that took place in Timisoara, Romania, themed covers, as in song covers. And we immediately knew we wanted to make a cover of Goff's work and represent those. Start to think about how we could represent the relationships in the work and how we could point to architecture's capacity to reveal broader cultural narratives through its own instruments. In other words, we wanted to explore these connections through drawing, and specifically to redraw 3 of his iconic houses, this time looking away from their dominant and idiosyncratic forms, and shifting our focus to the material histories and particular contexts that informed their assemblies. So here are the drawings in the original exhibition in Romania.
And to be clear, these are the drawings that you can see in the permanent architecture galleries designed by our dear friend Storm and Kelley that the Art Institute has acquired. So that's why we're showing them today. So through these drawings, we wanted to explore drawing itself as a kind of dynamic experience. We thought about graphic novels and also Chinese scrolls. I think this is a video that's not playing, but that's totally fine. It's dynamic if you see them in person, even if you don't see it. Is it? No, it's not playing on that screen. Dynamism. Each drawing layers information about the architecture itself with depictions of its material form, drawing from their myths, their histories, and anecdotes to show how each emerged as a kind of economic or cultural portrait of its time. In the Bavinger House, for example, describing how stone was sourced by local art students from a nearby hill and trucked over by site, also dynamited, or how aircraft cable, readily available following the war, was used to hang the house's sleeping pods, which were clad in fishing netting. Zooming out, That's the fishing netting. Zooming out, thank you for clicking, by the way. I see it's barely participating. Zooming out, you see how the narratives come together around an unrolled elevation, which you see back here, of the spiral structure, whose form you can see projected in shadow on the right side. Stone, glass, hardware, and the oil drill, of course, all brought together under one epic roof. The world of the building enmeshed in broader stories beyond the architect and client at large. Or at the Ford House, for example, where, as we've seen, the Quonset frame was borrowed from military barracks. So we kind of imagine the life of those barracks, and paired with playing marbles that were used as light refractors, or that's marbles, or naval rope used as a ceiling cover. Zooming out again, wartime symbols were reappropriated by Goff and displayed as domestic artifacts, just like the proliferation of plastics, aluminum, and plywood from other military applications that we saw ubiquitously used across the design world at large. And finally, at Shinnencon, we found Goff at his most kitsch. From the goose feathers that would surface the interior ceilings, which we imagined coming from nightclub feather boas, to the glass cullet that came out of bottle processing plants, this one was true, to the cellophane that would act as a chandelier. Together, these materials produce a densely textured, inspiringly cheap environment that registered as bespoke form, the mix of high and low, a kind of thrilling set for us of camp discoveries.
And by means of introducing ourselves to this conversation, we wanted to share how, in our own work and practice, it's typically shaped by similar constellations of objects that are inherited or borrowed, purchased on discount, found at a local big box store, and on occasion pulled straight out of a dumpster, like this one, and slotted snag and retouched on the surface. These are all conditions we consider spoils of the market. In other words, things that become available to us only because they bear no value in the market outside as we know it. Like this lightly used gallery drywall becoming a new ornamental white box gallery. Or leftover sets from theaters held together by eye sculpted in the shape of joints. Cheap pre-engineered building systems, like mail order kits, hybridized with local building techniques to produce something new. Or in the case of adaptive reuse, entire buildings that demand infinite conversations and oftentimes improvisation and a lot of conversation on site. Entire theaters made of rental parts to be returned, or community structures made with leftover facade tests from high-end construction. We often think about these spoils as ways to combat architecture's challenging role with waste production, but also with a sense of perpetual optimism and the power of excess to help us rewrite material stories in our own building practice.
So we're going to close there, but wanted to end by thanking Allison and Craig once again and the Art Institute at large for the invitation to do this. So while we're not Goff experts, we are huge fans, and it was an amazing opportunity to spend 2 years kind of like playing with the work and looking at the archive. In Goff, we find alongside his gayness and alongside his talent, a kind of profound optimism in a world that's so full of junk and stuff and kind of useless materials. We feel a deep kinship to his love of these market spoils, and seeing them so beautifully incorporated into his work gives us the kind of pink plastic North Star we never knew we needed, but that has sort of successfully reoriented us away from a kind of exhausted cynicism over the material conditions that we've inherited as young designers, and instead towards something that feels like it can revel in the joy of just creative practice at large. So that's been like an amazing thing that we've gotten to do, and we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Evie and Joffer. Thank you, Carrie and Thomas, for sharing these projects and these reflections from your teaching and your practice. And I guess I'll start off, our question was just now that Bruce Goff Material Worlds has now opened, which is a large retrospective, it has a checklist of 205 objects on it, and from each of your projects looking at different parts of Goff. Now that you've had a chance to see the exhibition, spent some time with Goff, I was just wondering if there's anything new that strikes you about Goff, or anything that's surprising about him, seeing the sort of full scope of this life and practice across 66 years of activity.
I can start with a dumb one, I guess, which is one of the conversations that we had a lot throughout our kind of collaboration was Goff's extremely inspiring dedication to painting as a practice. He painted throughout his entire career. His paintings are actually phenomenal, which I'm sure any of you who've seen the exhibition know firsthand. It's actually the advertisements that are all over Chicago are his paintings. And I was joking with Craig, I'm sure a lot of people come to this show thinking they're seeing a painting show, and they get in, it's just like architecture drawings and a disco ball when you walk in. But I think like one of the things that really feels effective in seeing the show come together, like personally, is the one-to-one relationship between the kind of studies he was doing as a painter and the kind of ensuing architectures that corresponded with those paintings. There isn't like a direct relationship, but I think there's a lot of indirect ties. And we really, like, I didn't get that until I could see them and really bounce between the work and the paintings, instead of seeing them more as a kind of like linear chronology, as we always had in flipping through checklists or going through a slideshow. So that was pretty nice.
Yeah. I think that's something really wonderful about the show. And I know this was always your intent, so it's almost like cheating a little bit in highlighting it, but understanding Goff not as a utopian architect, but as a hardcore builder who wanted to be down and dirty and at the construction site. And you see these drawings and they're phantasmagorical, and you can't possibly imagine they refer to real buildings until you start seeing these translations and understand how committed he was to making things in the real world and to reinventing how making happens in each project.
Evie's being very modest because it was their suggestion to pair working drawings with the presentation drawings to really reinforce this fact that although these drawings often seem like you're stepping into a fantasy world, they were extremely buildable and built in many, many different times.
I've recently had a conversation with the architect, John Vinci, who said, Allison, that he sent you a note suggesting that he took issue with the Jenks quotation about, let me see if I can get it right, Goff being the Michelangelo of kitsch, which, like, I think Carrie and I are okay with that, but the Goff that we familiarized ourselves with like 5 years ago was certainly not that. I think that it was maybe a different kind of fascination that we had that was like predated maybe the Goff that most people know, like the material explorations, the kind of glossiness of kitsch that comes with that, and for us it was really inspiring to kind of maybe more appreciate like someone who like bypassed kind of standard kind of academic routes even for an architect at that time to really kind of work through building, which for us was really inspiring. I mean, some exquisite details in Tulsa, as well as some really unpolished ones. And I think we probably gravitated more to the latter for, I think, architects who also have kind of a practice that is constantly looking at kind of other architecture. It was it's kind of lovely to see, I guess, go back in time to kind of see someone in formation. Also within a place that I think had a maybe very big impact on him that we maybe tend to forget.
Exactly. Maybe I can go back to your presentations, because I was really struck by the fact that you are both teams are talking about these really dense sociological, material, economic histories, which I feel like Goff pretty actively suppressed in discussing his own work. And I guess my question might be different for both teams. One for you both, how did you pick Goff out of all the architects you could choose to kind of think about some of these underlying questions? And I think Jaffer and Evie, like, how do you feel? Like, do you feel differently about all of this kind of consumerism that underpins Goff after doing these kind of deep dives into these discrete material histories?
I'll begin with that one. I mean, Thomas can maybe get a little bit deeper into Goff specifically, but it was at a time that we were and are grappling with the ways in which place impacts design. And because of the charged history of the economically, racially that Tulsa was undergoing in a very short amount of time, it was rich with a lot of influence. And on top of that, you have somebody beginning their career, and these are not buildings that you know that architect, also not an architect that I knew very well. And so that created a great opportunity to invite students to say, there's no history book on this guy. You're going to have to go and look. We're all going to have to look and learn. And that, like, pedagogically was very meaningful because there really wasn't a lot written on Goff. So for performing the kind of work that we love to do, it kind of demands that attention. And so this was an experiment on the most non-canonical projects by a sort of obscure architect who now, thanks to you both,
Hopefully we'll have a little
you
more
all,
exposure.
is a little bit less obscure.
Yeah, I agree. It started with Tulsa.
And now there's an amazing catalog, so there's a lot of writing on Goff that everyone
There's a
should
bit
buy
more.
and
There's a
read.
bit more.
Thanks for the question. I mean, look, I think I don't want to speak for both of us, but for me, architecture is always ever only a symbol of economy. You know, like architecture is a blunt tool of capitalism in the market. Like architecture is always beholden to kind of trends in the market. So that exists just as a kind of ontology of practice. So if that's true, which I believe it is, then why not make it about the fun part of the economy? Like the everyday kind of like quotidian, like buying shit at a dollar store or like buying like, you know, feathers and gluing them to a ceiling instead of the kind of like slick late stage capitalist version of economic reflection, which is like Norman Foster or like high-techism or like glittering towers all over the city. So for me, the joy in Goff is like the joy in celebrating the stupidity of economy instead of its kind of like machinations and evilness. And I think that's just like built into all of the work. And it's like a thing that we just took particular joy in. And like seeing it, I mean, this was you guys, you know, that we start with the realia. Like the first thing you see, and I was saying to Allison, one of my favorite pieces in the show, again, hopefully all of you have seen it, is like you walk in and like you see the disco ball, but then you turn right and you see this like hilarious carpet tile necklace, which is like kind of perfectly mounted, and it just looks so silly, like something out of Project Runway or something of like, I like went dumpster diving and then made like this kind of fancy little necklace. And I think that's to me the joy of Goff, and like that kind of reawakens my interest in economy, not as this thing that I'm always trying to like critique and resist, but actually one that feels like it has a kind of latent potential of like a kind of other form of radical politics, which kind of recenters its gaze on a slightly different, let's say, medium or subject.
Yeah. No, I have a very similar response to this, that as architects, we don't really ever make buildings, right? We make a couple of things. We make drawings and we make specification packages. So we send people shopping and then tell them how to assemble the grocery list in a way, right? So where you send people, where you source from, how these things come together is that where we have power in our profession. And it really manifests in ways that we share. And what I really love about your project is that you're reminding students that they're able to enter that conversation, that, you know, to continue with the food metaphor, the recipe is not done, right? The buildings keep on cooking and the market still exists and materials keep coming in and can leave the equation.
And if I can continue that point about the teaching and the sort of lessons for students, I mean, you all variously teach here in Chicago, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in New York. If you could just talk about what sort of lessons you find or have you found Goff have for students in the classroom, or as they're looking at buildings in situ, or if they're looking at Goff in books or even just pictures online, because there's so much documentation of Goff houses out in the world. And one of the things I find so striking about Goff, because so many of his houses are in rural or suburban areas, most people's encounter with Goff is really through photographs or in publications. It's kind of, you know, it's difficult. I don't know how frequently anyone in this room has gotten to Beaver, Oklahoma, where there are 2 Bruce Goff houses, but, you know, it's a population of 1500 and 1950 when these two Goff houses were built, and it's still about a population of 1500. And so I think sort of the experience that students might have in studying Goff in the classroom or in the studio with you all.
Well, what I love about the drawing that you made is that it points to the larger teams involved in a project. And I think what's been like a question on my mind or troubling me or I've been thinking about relative to Goff is we're trying to dismantle this like notion of the like lone wolf, like genius architect in schools today. That it's a collaborative practice, and Goff was so unique, right, in his visions, which is just a different time in the way that we are considering our practice at the discipline today. So that's been on my mind.
What is the name of the drafts person who takes credit for a lot of the drawings in the show?
There's quite a few.
Right.
So I think, I'm not sure who you might be thinking of, but fortunately, lots of the drawings are signed. I mean, this is something that's worth saying out loud, that even in a studio as small as Goff's, he was working with very talented architects who did a lot of the visualization of the drawings or the designs that they made. We chose not to call them just delineators because, our feeling was that in a practice, ideas are being exchanged. So even if Goff has the final say, there's a lot of different hands and minds at work.
And so I think to that point, there were aspects of the show that kind of remind us, for similar reasons, why John Sohn is such an interesting architect for kind of the close collaborations with delineators that he held. But Goff could also draw like an angel. And that goes without saying. And I think our fascination was thinking of him as a collaborator for Endicott Rush and Endicott early in his career with little to no training and having to, I think, make a name for himself kind of in that fashion. And maybe that was more impactful to us than some of the later work. And that's something we try to impart on our students.
I wanted to highlight to Carrie's earlier point about the drawings that what's the kind of excerpt of using dynamite to extract rock for the Ford house, for the Babinger house, depicts allegedly students of Goff going to the rock and like using the dynamite and carrying that rock over. So I think there was just like a really, I don't know that I can attest that to this being a true story, but really the students were not just in the classroom with Bruce Goff, but also on the construction site and like getting to understand how buildings come to life, which I wish was something we did more in pedagogy in the context of American academia. Something I found truly shocking was that, as an architect who's practiced for many, many years, and we studied many of Goff's drawings closely. We reproduced them in 3D models. We translated them in this interpretive drawings. And then we went to the Goff house, and I was shocked. Like nothing was exactly what I expected. Like the proportions were different. The relationship of the spaces was not what I expected. I had inhabited the drawings, and yet the reality of it all was just light years apart. The smell was so present. Like it's a visceral experience that you can't really reduce to lines and perspectives.
I was just going to add one quick thing, which is to the point about him not being a lone wolf, or to dispel the myth of the lone wolf. Like in terms of teaching, I think it's also interesting to talk to students about, Goff's context in a broader kind of architectural and disciplinary history, and the fact that he was a kind of pupil and student of Frank Lloyd Wright and worked in all of these offices, came of age in a certain time. Like those things have meaning, like where there are similarities and differences, and where he sort of established a completely antithetical or novel or personal way of working, seems like a way to help students situate themselves within like broader lineages. And then to your point, Evie, earlier today we were at Jeannie Gang's office, famed Chicago architect, and Mark Schendel, her partner, who sort of co-runs the office, we chatted with him for a few minutes about Goff, and he told us something I didn't know, which maybe we can double check with you guys, which is apparently Goff outfitted some kind of like camper van as like a mobile office with fold-out drafting tables and like I assume some kind of like floor mattress, and that was not told to us, and he would just drive around to the sites and kind of like set up this little temporary workstation, and would just like camp out, at the Ford House for like, however long in order to kind of redraw the project as it was being built. Whether or not this is true, I don't know. You are shaking your head in a way that makes me think you've never heard this before.
Never have.
So it can't be true. I'm going to blame Mark for this one, but
It's a good fantasy.
it's a good fantasy, and
I
it's
love
actually a
the fantasy.
plausible fantasy because like there's so much ad hocism built into the work itself that one has to assume that you didn't just draw all of this from the outset. That's just impossible. But instead, that architecture becomes this kind of like choreography of pre-planning and then in situ assemblage that needs to be kind of like negotiated through a novel way of working entirely. And I just thought that was like a really nice sort of the messiness comes through this other paradigm of work, I think.
But if I may, I would love to turn this question to the both of you. And I'm very curious because, I understand you've toured the space with so many students over the months, and I'm curious what students respond to and where do you see them getting kind of fixated and curious and the kind of takeaways.
Before you answer that, so your point, Jaffer, Goff famously did not drive.
Wow.
Nothing about the stories.
However, I will say that he has, Goff had a project in Gower, Missouri, where he took a sort of prefabricated trailer shelter and adapted it with his sort of own design with these triangular windows, adds a porch onto it. And so that might be the project that I'm thinking of. But I think the other point that you're all saying about just sort of building, I think one of the things that really struck for Allison and me was just sort of the fidelity in Goff's buildings between his drawings and what you see, even though the experience might be different. And I think a lot of that is because of the sort of trust and faith with the people that he was working with in his office. And so there's a portion in the exhibition where we have this beautiful atmospheric drawing for the Grider House in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And below it in the case is the construction drawing for that house. And the delineator on that is Robert Faust. Robert Faust was the associate architect that worked in Goff's studio and was down in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, who was overseeing the construction, working with the builder and the contractor to ensure that the roof was curved, the stucco was purple, and the entrance tunnel was just the right height above the moat in front of your house. Allison, I'll let you answer Evie's question.
Yeah, I'm not sure there was one single thing. I think students have really been taken with the paintings, I think in particular, because they are such strange objects. A lot of them are made using techniques that it took Craig and a conservator weeks to figure out because he was using all sorts of things. Sometimes he was dipping paint into a toothbrush and flicking it on the surface, sometimes using stenciling, really creating kind of miniature worlds. And I think those are so compelling. We got a lot of questions about the models, which was funny for us because Goff really is an architect of drawing. People said on the panel, we have a few models, but it really wasn't the primary way that he iterated or even really presented ideas to his clients. I don't know, Craig, anything come to mind for students?
I mean, I think when we go through the exhibition with groups, and especially with architecture students, I think, it is a retrospective exhibition, but I think one of the striking things is just how prolific Goff was, not just in terms of the duration of his career, but just how many projects he made and how inventive and different these over 500 designs that he made for projects, and how sort of not, at the same time also not precious about the designs that he made. The Ford House famously, he designed 3 different versions of, just based on the feedback from Ruth and Sam Ford, and not still using a prefabricated Quonset hut system, but rearranging it, reworking it based on feedback. And I think that's sort of one of the striking things that sort of stands out to me of just how active and creative he is in architecture, but really across the arts.
I think we have time for one more question for you all. And I know that to different degrees, you all work on domestic projects from time to time. And that's one of the things that we've been talking a lot with our visitors and audiences is he was not a futurist. He was very much living in the present, but he was imagining a kind of way of living in space and kind of the relationships we have with our domestic interiors that was pretty radical even now. And I just wondered if that might be something like, is there a way that his kind of experimentalism has a place for domestic design today or not?
I mean, I think it remains, like the domestic space remains as one of the one of few places where there's not over specialization within the field. And so it's a bit cliche. If there are any architects in the room, you'll know that's where you can have some fun. And I would encourage any architect who has the opportunity to design domestic space to kind of question kind of issues of comfort, issues of accessibility, and find ways to invent. Because there are very few typologies that remain that allow us to do that. And I think Goff sets kind of a great example.
Yeah, I think what's comforting about working in a small practice is that oftentimes we find ourselves working with clients who specifically want to work with us, which is, such a gift. We don't have many clients, but those we do are people who are committed to our way of thinking and designing. And I think that affords us an opportunity to develop a relationship that includes these conversations of, it's such a luxury to make your own home. Like so few people get to do it. And to get to do it with someone who you see eye to eye with vis-a-vis materiality and comfort, like Thomas is saying, is so rare. So oftentimes that leads you to an opportunity where you might do something differently. Like I can't stop thinking about the "we don't like your house either" post that the Ford House had under construction, right? You only get to do this if you get to build your very own house with a very bizarre architect that doesn't have all too many clients and is all yours, right? So hopefully, we never had anyone that cool, but hopefully one day we will.
One day.
Yep.
I was just going to say I'm a glutton for punishment, so I'm going to say something and let Craig discredit me again on stage. One of my favorite conspiracy theories in researching Goff, which I think I shared with you both, and you both were like, no, that didn't happen. But I will believe it for a while, is that the son of the Bavinger family was perhaps responsible for burning down the house many years after it was built. And the sort of whatever metonymic Reddit thread that I was on, whatever platform it was, basically tracked this whole thing. So the Bavingers were this the artist couple. They built this spiral house. There were no bedrooms. They were just these fishnet rooms that were hanging from whatever aircraft cables from the ceiling. And there was no privacy. It was basically just like a domestic experiment. And it was totally eschewing whatever standard house design you'd ever imagine. And apparently the son was driven mad by the kind of atypicality of the house. And over the course of 40 years, decided that this was something that was so, grievous to him that he burned it down. And I think there's something really inspiring about designing an architecture that elicits such a reaction. So I will say, I think what I've learned from Goff is to take risks and come what may.
I think the sociological impact of a single house is probably a little overstated, but I do think that Goff was a lot of his clients recall living in tiny, cramped apartments their whole life and being desperate for something that felt really liberated, and boy did Goff deliver. I mean, pods, ramps, pools, interior gardens, very few things that you might find in a conventional house. I don't know, Craig, you can disagree, but I never heard anyone have any bad words for the experience of living in these spaces. And I think that was because they were just so full of discovery. And I think, unfortunately, we've become really complacent with our houses being places where we simply, reside rather than places where we can actually explore. I think we might be out of time. looking for someone, but we will definitely stick around if people have questions. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.